Part 3 of the volume is called A Cultural Phenomenon, Did Shakespeare Write Shakespeare? And here it's a sense of the afterlife of the discussion, the kinds of energies which it makes possible. We've just mentioned earlier Paul Franson's overview of fictional treatments of Shakespeare's authorship from the University of Utrecht. Kate McCluskey is writing about the contemporary desire to tell stories rather than to get bogged down in historical fact, and that fictions will always be more attractive to the human mind than truth with gaps, because it's part of what makes the story palatable.
But that's what I would say, that the orthodox story, well, no, I don't agree. And I think by using the term conspiracy theory, you're trying to just automatically dismiss anything that doesn't agree with your point of view. And I think, you know, actually there are valid points of view on all sides of this debate.
It's interesting how the authorship discussion, the Shakespeare authorship discussion, hovers in the background of other discussions about what might seem much more serious conspiracy theories, such as those around 9/11. Or Barack Obama not being born in the States.
I think this is an entirely false comparison. We're not talking about conspiracy theories.
Sorry, we must be talking about conspiracy theory if we say no. Excuse me, just one moment. If you're saying that there is massive evidence that somebody called Shakespeare was associated with these plays, if you're then saying that that man wasn't Shakespeare, you're saying that the real Shakespeare, you're not disputing that the real Shakespeare existed,
no.
that there was a conspiracy in which he took part to conceal the true authorship and that he was the front man for it.
Now, a conspiracy is not the same as a conspiracy theory. Conspiracies do exist. The word conspiracy has been in the dictionary for a long time. Shakespeare himself writes about conspiracies. There were an enormous number of plots, you know, the Babington plot and the main plot and the by-plot of that time, which are all conspiracies.
Well, let's call this one the anti-Shakespeare plot.
That's very different from a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory means something that's not even worth our time of day to look at. We'll just dismiss it out of hand. And I appreciate that you think that that's what the North Stratford, it's not worth your time of day, because your belief is very, very strong.
No, it's not belief.
It's belief.
It's our knowledge based on evidence.
Well, it's based on evidence that doesn't actually all add up.
Well, there we fundamentally
fundamentally disagree.
We fundamentally disagree. And this is the kinds of discussion which the book is making available. Let's not forget this declaration of reasonable doubt. There we have Michael York, Derek Jacobi, and Mark Rylance, all prominent actors.
Who you've called anti-Shakespeareans, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, they're Shakespearean actors with anti-Shakespearean
But
beliefs.
they're not anti-Shakespearean.
They all think Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare.
Yep, no one involved in this is anti-Shakespearean. Everyone I know who is a Shakespeare skeptic loves the author Shakespeare, loves the works of Shakespeare, gets deeply involved in them.
Then why don't they want Shakespeare strapped upon Avon to be the author?
It's not a matter of wanting, you see. You seem to think that there is some kind of pathology going on here. It's a matter of not searching for the author and then finding him strangely absent, and then looking at the evidence and saying, well, why doesn't this evidence exist?
But do you see denials?
When it does exist for other people.
Denials of history.
It's not a denial of history. But if you look at this completely neutrally, if you came to the evidence entirely neutrally, and you looked at the 70+ documents relating to William Shakespeare of Stratford, and you know some historian looked at this guy and it didn't have that name on it, and you asked him, what does this guy do for a living? Any neutral historian would say, well, he buys and sells grain, he buys and sells tithes, he lends money, interest, he chases people through the courts. He's a businessman, he's a broker, he even brokered a marriage. You can see him in the role of broker. That is documented. Now, if he was a writer, all the evidence during his lifetime that he was a writer, I agree with you that once you get to 1623, it is established that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon is the author of the works, and people then start coming to Stratford, not finding much, I have to say, because apparently his daughters don't seem to know that he's a writer. Other people who should have known that he was a writer don't seem to know that he's a writer.
Well, his daughter's an interesting example, because alongside Shakespeare's grave is Susanna Hall's grave, witty above her sex, but that's not all. Why to salvation as good mistress calls, something of Shakespeare was in that. This holy of his with whom she's now in bliss. So she is evoked as the poet's daughter in that Shakespeare's mentioned.
Why would he leave her functionally illiterate? Why would she not be able to recognise her husband's handwriting?
She could write.
Well, if you look at her handwriting, she's not someone who's who's.
What does that mean to look at someone's handwriting? That's nonsense. My doctor doesn't have. My doctor does not. Excuse me. My doctor does not have very good handwriting, but he gives me the right tablets, and it doesn't mean to say that he's illiterate.
But also you're talking about the absence of evidence. If you're talking about the absence of evidence, where is the evidence, the positive evidence that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare, or that the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare?
I absolutely agree with you. But the point is that all of the candidates, including yours, who you believe to be the true author, all based on circumstantial evidence.
Based on evidence.
But it's circumstantial, and it's circumstantial.
Based on evidence. How would any of these anti-Shakespeareans like the evidence to be? How bad would you like it to be before you start denying it and saying, well, actually, black is white? I think we're on very dangerous ground in construing history in our own image in this way.
I don't think that's what's happening here.
I think perhaps it might be. Let's look at this quotation from the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt chapter by Stuart Hampton Reeves. He's asking about what it's achieved. It started in 2007. It's out there. It was thought that the film Anonymous was going to increase the signatures. It didn't. There are spaces on that document reserved for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and the Shakespeare Institute, both of which are missing signatures. Surprise, surprise. This seems to be a gauntlet thrown down at the orthodox Shakespeareans. I don't like being called orthodox, if that's referring to me. From the declaration seems to be sort of simultaneously derived for their small-mindedness, I'm not small-minded, and yet crave acceptance from and happy to welcome anybody. So this is a very interesting quotation. And this sense that keeps coming up from people against Shakespeare, saying, oh, you're small-minded, you're in denial, you're an industry in denial.
But it's thrown in both directions, because you've just called this denial, haven't you?
You're being over-defensive.
Well, unfortunately...
what I'm calling denial is the denial of lots of different kinds of evidence, wrapping it all up and saying, oh, it's a homogenous whole.
But that's
and we
what's
can
being
just
said on the other side as well. The trouble is both sides are accusing the other side of denying evidence.
What's being said on the Shakespeare side is these are individual pieces of evidence, the most likely outcome of which suggests that Shakespeare strapped upon Avon wrote the paper. We must move on because I want to get on to questions. I want to remind us briefly that this book is part of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust authorship campaign. One of its prime expressions was 60 Minutes with Shakespeare.com, where you can hear 60 very prominent people, including the Prince of Wales himself, adding to the discussion and making it live in a vibrant and an interesting way. And we also had the great Shakespeare cover. Now, this is where I want to talk about the phrase anti-Shakespearean as opposed to anti-Stratfordian. Anti-Stratfordian is rhetoric by the anti-Shakespeareans. And I hope...
Well, how is anti-Shakespearean not rhetoric from your side?
Well, it is. It's in response to... It's trying to put oxygen into the debate, because you cannot have Shakespeare without Stratford.
But you're trying to win the debate by changing terms. You're trying to win
I'm trying to put in... Well, that's what debates do, isn't it?
Well, changing the terms is a fairly underhand way of trying to close the debate down.
No, it's not, because behind my change of terms is a philosophical and literary proposition, which is as follows, that you cannot remove the author from the context which made that author possible. You wouldn't suggest for a moment that Charles Dickens could be separated from his London, or that Michelangelo could be separated from Florence and Rome. Therefore, why should Shakespeare be a special case? Why should you say it's fine to have Hamlet, but it wasn't the man from Stratford who wrote it? This to us seemed a nonsense. And actually, it's really interesting that you're finding the term anti-Shakespearean problematic, because we've obviously hit a nerve in our use of it. And in covering Shakespeare Stratford on the day that Anonymous was launched, we were saying, okay, if it's not Shakespeare, remove him entirely from a national life.
And
we also took
I don't think, because Shakespeare the author would still
imagination.
exist,
Shakespeare's
the
fancy was wiped out for a day, because the plays would exist, but our understanding of where he came from and who and what made him a unique living and breathing person
could be deepened if we had a better idea of who he was.
It's just been ignored by the anti-Shakespeareans. The Afterwit by James Shapiro reminds us of the dismal box office showing of Anonymous. Has undoubtedly been a setback for them.
It was a poor film.
Emmerich's own admission that the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust shares the blame for his film's rapid demise is an indication that an organised response contributed to that end. The facts and analysis presented in this volume will make responding to the next film or the next campaign or the next question posed about Shakespeare's authorship by a student or a stranger or even a teacher that much easier. And I wonder if that will be the case on both sides. It's time for questions. Thank you, Roz and Stanley, for a most lively discussion.